America is on the verge of an economic collapse right now in the fall of 2021, particularly in Democrat-run states that voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election. These are states like New York, California, Vermont, and Maryland that have massive job losses since the pandemic, way higher than their Republican-run counterparts. This is a topic, unfortunately, that the mainstream media as well as the Biden administration would like to sweep under the rug. They don't want you to know just how much Democrat-run states that have enacted authoritarian COVID policies and mandates, how much they're struggling economically. Because guess what? When you take away people's freedom, when you close businesses and you drive people out of your state and city, turns out your economy starts to stink. And that's exactly what's happening. A place like California is down 1 million jobs over the last 18 months during the pandemic. Meanwhile, places like Utah, Arizona, and Idaho have actually gained jobs during the pandemic. This isn't a U.S. recession. This isn't a U.S. jobs downturn. This is a blue state, Biden state economic downturn. And in this video, I'm going to give you the objective data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics so you can see just how bad the situation is in blue states across the country. And this is a problem that's only going to get worse now that government stimulus measures are going away, interest rates are going up, eviction moratoriums are going away. We're going to start to actually see the real realities of these job losses take hold in blue states. And I think that means big problems for society, economy, the local housing markets here. We're going to have a lot of pain in blue states going forward. Let's get into the data so you can see what I'm talking about. We're going to start things off with a map like we normally do on this channel. And here we're looking at the 48 continental U.S. states on the basis of their job growth since the pandemic started. This is data that comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics Current Population Survey. I'll have a link in the description if you want to look this data up for yourself. Starting things off, you can see the states in blue have the heaviest job losses. So a place like California has seen its job count decline from 18.6 million to 17.6 million. That's a 1 million decline, 5.6% in percentage terms over the last 18 months. That is really bad. California is still in the midst of one of its worst economic downturns of all time. A place like New York, a very similar situation. You can see here jobs have declined from 9.1 million to 8.6 million. That's a 500,000 decline, 5.3% in percentage terms. And you can particularly see that the Northeast is heavy in blue. Vermont is down 7.9%. Connecticut's down 9%. New Jersey's down 6.8%. Maryland's down 7.2%. Lots and lots of economic destruction in the Northeast during the COVID pandemic. Meanwhile, the states in red have either had very meager small job losses or actually gained jobs. So for instance, Utah is up 2.2% on its job count. Utah has gained 35,000 jobs during the COVID pandemic, as has Idaho, as has South Dakota, Kansas, and Oklahoma, South Carolina. These are places in red which have actually grown their economies over the last 18 months, in stark contrast to places like New York and California, which have been hemorrhaging employment. And you guys really need to understand this, that the so-called U.S. economic downturn is not a national economic downturn. It is heavily concentrated in certain states in the Northeast as well as California that have gotten absolutely hammered from an economic standpoint. Businesses have closed, people have left, people have stopped looking for work in these states, and as a result, a place like California, 18 months on, is still 1 million down on its job count compared to where it was prior to the COVID pandemic. Now, the interesting thing to ask is, what's going on in these states that's dictating these differences, right? I mean, those are really stark contrasts. So there must be some underlying explanation here. Like, this can't be happening by chance. Why are places like Utah and Idaho and Oklahoma doing so much better than places like New York, Illinois, and California? And one of the simplest variables that seems to explain this variation is how these states voted in the 2020 presidential election, which is what you can see here on the x-axis. We're showing the percentage of the voting population that voted for Joe Biden in that election, and we're comparing it to the percentage change in jobs since the pandemic started. And what you can see is these states in the bottom left, like Vermont, Maryland, California, Rhode Island, Connecticut, they all had a very high share of people that voted for Joe Biden, and they also have massive job losses on the order of 6 to 9% over the last 18 months. If you guys are enjoying the data in this video and you want to get the data and message out there to more people, make sure to hit this like button. That's what's going to tell YouTube it's a good video and spread it out to more people. Additionally, make sure to leave a comment. I want to hear what you're seeing in the local economy and housing market, particularly if you're in a blue state. Make sure to comment below. But it's a completely different story on the opposite end of this graph here in the top right. Places like South Dakota, Idaho, Utah, West Virginia, Wyoming. These are states that had a very low vote share for Biden, around 30-35%, yet they are some of the best performing state economies in America over the last 18 months. And it's amazing how few people actually know or understand this data, which again comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the government agency that reports on employment. It's saying very clearly that Democrat-run states, places that voted for Joe Biden, are having a really tough time from an economic perspective. And I think at this point, 18 months into the pandemic, with this type of strong relationship, this isn't an accident. This is not merely a coincidence anymore. Maybe 6 to 9 months ago, when we were in the early stages of the pandemic, you could say, this was just maybe some type of fluke, and maybe has something to do with the percentage of leisure and hospitality employment in a certain state, or maybe this was just going to bounce back very quickly. But at this juncture, 18 months on, these things are starting to become permanent, right? You have people in California and New York that have been out of a job now for a year and a half. All the research on long-term unemployment, which is unemployment for over 6 months, suggests it's extremely damaging to society as well as long-term health for people. When someone's unemployed for more than 6 months, their life expectancy goes down. Believe it or not. Yeah, so there's actually a heavy link between economic destruction and deterioration in public health. Now, there's more than meets the eye here. It's not just that a state voted for Joe Biden that's potentially causing these economic differences. It's kind of what voting for Joe Biden is associated with in terms of policy, and that, of course, has a lot to do with response to the COVID pandemic. By and large, Democrat-run states that voted for Joe Biden have enacted much stronger, more authoritarian rules and regulations and restrictions related to the COVID pandemic. In many of these places, you have limits on gatherings. You had businesses that were closed for a while. You had mask mandates. Now you have vaccine mandates in some cities in these states. It turns out when you look at the data that the more authoritarian a state is in regards to their pandemic response, the worse the economy is performing. So guys, now we're back to the scatter plot here, but instead of looking at Biden vote percentage on the x-axis, now we're looking at pandemic restrictions on the x-axis. And this is data that comes from Wallet Hub. I'll have a link to it in the description. They did analysis on how heavy the regulations were in states related to gathering limits, mask mandates, bars and restaurant closures, all these different things back in April 2021, and they ranked the states from least restrictive here on the right side to most restrictive on the left side. And once again, you can see there's a really strong relationship. The states here on the left with the biggest COVID restrictions, Vermont, Virginia, New York, California, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, the states that had the biggest restrictions, the most mandates during COVID, have the biggest job losses. And then the states here in the top right, South Dakota, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Mississippi, Wyoming, Florida, the states with the fewest COVID restrictions have the fewest job losses or have actually gained jobs in some cases. And that makes sense. You can't just tell businesses to shut down. You can't just take away people's freedom perpetually and continue to do that without consequences. And you're seeing what the consequences are on that graph. And things look even worse if you zoom in a little bit from the state level all of a sudden to looking at how certain cities are doing in some of these blue states, and you're like, oh my goodness, things are really, really bad. Let's get started by looking at New York City. And so on this graph, we're looking at New York City's economy on the basis of job growth going back nearly 5 decades to the mid-70s. So we have lots and lots of data here. This again comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics current population survey, and we're looking at the 24-month percentage change in jobs. And what I just really want to immediately point you guys to is the fact that New York City through August 2021, the most recent data available, is down 8.4% on its job count compared to 2 years ago. This, of course, is an improvement over where New York was in the middle of 2020 during the pandemic when jobs were down by like 20%. However, you can see in a very concerning fashion that the job growth has now moderated and New York seems to be stuck in this like minus 8% job growth range. And that's really, really bad because if you track this yellow line, which is where New York's job growth is today over the last 2 years, you can see it's the worst it's ever experienced. You can see here in the peak of the great financial recession around 2009-2010, New York lost 3.7% of its jobs. In the recession after 9/11, New York lost 1.4% of its jobs. In the early 90s recession, which hit New York City really, really hard, it lost 6%. And then in the early 80s recession, it lost 3%. So we are in uncharted territory in terms of how poorly New York City's economy is performing right now. And this is something that I think people, again, could largely ignore when we had all extended unemployment assistance and stimulus checks and all these moratoriums going on. It kind of took away the reality of what these job losses meant to a society and a city. However, everyone, now that those things are going away, all of a sudden the reality of an 8% loss in jobs over 2 years, which is massive, is going to start to really impact New York City's social fabric. It's going to impact its housing market. Things are going to get really bad bad in New York City very, very soon due to how many jobs the city has lost. And what's really concerning is that leadership in New York City and New York State and many of these other Democrat-run states aren't talking about this. Like, they're not prioritizing economic recovery. They are still laser focused on COVID. Even though vaccines are widely available, everyone has the power to choose to protect themselves with a vaccine. Despite that fact, they still solely focus on COVID at the expense of their local economy. Now here's the same graph, job losses over the last 50 years, but instead of looking at New York, now we're looking at Los Angeles County, and you can see it's a very similar situation. The 6.7% decline in jobs in LA County over the last 2 years is right there with the worst downturns LA has ever experienced, pretty much on par with the 2009 downturn during the Great Recession and housing collapse, as well as on par with the early 90s collapse that occurred in LA. And despite this performance, LA County just enacted a widespread vaccine mandate that basically takes away people's ability to go and do anything unless they're vaccinated. Now again, they're looking at this from a public health perspective. I'm not knowledgeable on that. I'm not commenting on that. I'm merely saying from an economic perspective that this is likely going to make things even worse when you have people being forced to quit their jobs, people being incentivized to leave an area because there's even more mandates going forward. And so my question is, what is leadership in Democrat states and cities? What are they thinking? What are they doing? Like, are they aware of these numbers, these horrific economic figures that in a place like New York City in 50 years, we've never seen anything like this in terms of job losses? Like, is Bill de Blasio paying attention to this? Is Eric Adams paying attention to this? Do they care at all about people losing their livelihoods and not regaining their livelihoods and people leaving the city for good, businesses shutting down? Like, is this on the radar at all for Democrat-run places right now? It doesn't seem like it is. It seems like all that matters is COVID. That's it. Nothing else. Any other priority in society is a backseat, even though vaccines are widely available. Anyone can choose to protect themselves with a vaccine right now. You would think that that would reorient the thinking a little bit of some of these places. It doesn't seem to be. And I think part of the problem is Joe Biden. Joe Biden, his administration, sets the agenda for what a lot of Democrat-run places do. And the fact that Joe Biden still has made COVID like his number one talking point, his number one thing, economic recovery in the back seat, people's livelihoods and freedom, that's in the back seat with Joe Biden. I think the Democrat-run areas and cities and states, they're following suit. They're following the agenda set by him. And so far, these Democrat-run areas have gotten away with this, gotten away with the economic destruction they've inflicted because of government stimulus, extended unemployment insurance, stimulus checks, eviction foreclosure moratoriums, low interest rates. But all of those things are starting to change at this point. We have inflationary pressures. The political willpower for more stimulus probably is not going to be there in the same way. Interest rates are starting to go up. All of a sudden, the fairy tale land we've been living in for the last 18 months in terms of the economy, its impact on society, is going to become very, very real. And I think Democrat-run areas that are losing a lot of jobs, they're going to start to really feel the pain in terms of social discontent, poverty, more outward migration, housing market declines. They're going to start to feel that. They're going to start to feel the realities of the economies they've created. So if you guys appreciated this data, appreciate this video, just make sure to hit the like button. That's what's going to get this video out to more people so more people can see the realities of what's going on in this country economically. Additionally, if you enjoyed this data, you want to see more of it, make sure to hit the subscribe button. I come out with 3 of these data-driven videos per week, actually mostly on the US housing market, but I also cover, like in today's video, things that are going on more broadly economically, so make sure you're a subscriber. Also think about hitting the join button. I have a monthly newsletter that comes out for my channel members. When you hit join, pay $5 a month, you gain access to that monthly newsletter that has all types of data on the US economy and housing market. You can see a preview here on the screen, as well as my picks for markets to target, markets to avoid if you're looking at buying real estate. All right, everyone, until next time, this is Nick from eVenture Consulting signing off.